Thank you so much, Victor, for the introduction to the program, and thank you to all of you who have joined us today. For those here who don't know me, my name is Neilesh, and I teach history at the University of Victoria, and my areas of research and teaching include modern South Asian history, the history of migrations, and global history, alongside other topics. This is the second and final event of the Global South Colloquium for this semester, which is a seminar series on a yearly theme centered on an aspect of the history of the Global South. And this year's theme is Empire and Decolonization in the Modern World. And last semester, we were very lucky to host Adam Getachew, as well as Manu Karuka. And we just recently, 2 months ago, were able to learn from Dr. Nicole Quenjingaboites of Cambridge, who spoke about her recent book, Asian Placed Filipino Nation. And today we will hear from Dr. Sujit Sivasundaram, also of Cambridge, on his brand new book, Waves Across the South, A New History of Revolution and Empire. So I will say a few words about the protocol and then introduce our speakers. So in keeping with recent tradition, our speaker will present the book for the first third of the program for approximately half an hour. And this will be followed by 2 discussants. And this is a first for us, and we're hoping to do more of such programs where we integrate speakers and scholars from other parts of the world. And I will introduce everybody in just a minute. After the 2 responses, we will turn to an open Q&A and end at 12:30 p.m. Pacific time. So in terms of the question and answer period, as we have done in the past, we will entertain written questions through the question box, and there already has been a message in the question box. And so anybody who has a question at any point is welcome to write their question in the question box, and those questions will be forwarded to me on a Google Doc that I will have access to. When we get to the Q&A period at approximately 1 p.m., I will screen and read out the questions for the speaker as well as for possibly the panelists. So before we begin, I will just briefly introduce the speaker and the discussants. We are very lucky to have with us Dr. Sujit Sivasundaram, Director of the Center for South Asian Studies, Professor of World History in the Faculty of History, and Fellow at Gonville and Caius at the University of Cambridge. Dr. Sivasundaram specializes in the Indo-Pacific world and its many histories, and focuses on South and Southeast Asia, as well as the Indian Ocean more broadly. Books he has written before the book that we are discussing today include Islanded, Britain, Sri Lanka, and the Bounds of an Indian Ocean Colony. And that work follows from his first book, Nature and the Godly Empire, Science and the Evangelical Mission in the Pacific, 1795 to 1830, alongside many other articles and book chapters about these topics. Our discussants today feature Dr. Renisa Mawani, professor in sociology at the University of British Columbia and scholar of colonial legal history, oceans and oceanic studies, indigeneity, migration, amongst many other topics. Dr. Mawani is the author of numerous works, including the award-winning Across Oceans of Law, the Komagata Maru and Jurisdiction in the Time of Empire, as well as co-edited volumes, including the most recent with Antoinette Burton, Animalia, and Anti-Imperial Bestiary for Our Times. Our second discussant features Dr. John Rogers, the US Director of the American Institute for Sri Lankan Studies, historian of Sri Lanka and scholar of Sri Lankan history, as well as the social and legal history of modern South Asia and ethnicity and nationalism in South Asia. So we will begin with Dr. Sivasundaram and then turn to Dr. Mawani and Dr. Rogers, and then open to Q&A, again to end at 12:30 p.m. Pacific time. And with that, I turn the Zoom floor over to Dr. Sivasundaram.
Thank you very much, Neilesh, and thank you also to Victor for Victor's warm introduction. Neilesh extended this very generous invitation and has been absolutely wonderful at organizing and hosting this roundtable. And it's really an absolute pleasure to be with you and to present some of my work at a center explicitly devoted to Asia-Pacific initiatives, because indeed the category of Asia-Pacific in many ways defines quite a lot of what I do as a historian and the work that I've undertaken through the course of my career thus far. Thank you also to Renisa Mawani, who I don't think I've ever met, but whose work I very much admire, and John Rogers, a longtime friend, advisor, and wonderful colleague and scholar in Sri Lankan history for joining the roundtable as commentators. So I need to share my screen, and I think it's going to work. Let's just see whether it does. And hopefully you can see some slides now. Does that come across okay, Neilesh? Yeah. Brilliant. Okay. So what I promised to do is in about half an hour or so to give you a quick overview of my book, Waves Across the South. And it was finished in March last year, just prior to the pandemic. I just sent it off to the press just before the pandemic hit. And thankfully was able to finish the last line without being troubled in any way by COVID. So it came out in the UK last year, and the US version was supposed to be out by now, but it's going to be delayed by about a month, and it will be out in May next month. So Waves Across the South is a history of the Indian and Pacific Oceans in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, but it's not a world history that tries in a modish or shallow fashion to be encyclopedic, galloping, or universal. It's about this period, the late 18th and the early 19th centuries in these two oceans, and the period is traced in relation to the standoff between revolution and counter-revolutionary imperialism. So we know that this era saw the consolidation of the British Empire amongst its rivals, French, Dutch, Eurasian, as well as many others. The book sketches how this new kind of oceanic empire came to life as a result of the global tumult of revolution. The British Empire moved from sea to land and saw itself as an empire for liberty, which very much resonated with that period. In practice, it mounted a sinister counter-revolt, bypassing but not effacing forms of protest and agency, as well as existent religious, commercial, and cultural exchange across the seas of the South. So these prime modes of presence, of politics, of exchange, of militarism need to be cast, I argue, within the revolutionary potential of this age and as another pathway to the modern. So the book uses the age of revolutions, which is a concept, of course, dominated by Euro-Atlantic historians for the Indian and Pacific Oceans. And it repopulates that concept from below. So what it's trying to do is to tell the history of imperialism, of change, of revolution in this era from the perspective of ocean-facing locales and ocean-facing peoples. So Aboriginal Australians, Pacific Islanders, Malays, Mauritians, seafaring Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean peoples, who are often misplaced in this narrative of this era of the late 18th and early 19th century. So to be clear then, the Age of Revolutions as a concept, as used here, is the dynamic of engagement between the revolutionary potential of these peoples and the counter-revolutionary imperialism that they faced. So in methodological terms, what the book is trying to do is to foreground and juxtapose a series of non-orthodox areas, the small seas of the Indian and Pacific Oceans, as I call them, including, for instance, the Tasman Sea, the Southwest Indian Ocean, the Bay of Bengal, and the Persian Gulf. So in doing this, it argues that the encounter between revolution and counter-revolutionary empire look particular in each of these spaces, and that small sites, islands, ocean basins intensified the workings of this era. And that rather than writing romantically long-distance histories of connection and comparison, or indeed structuralist accounts of the Indian Ocean trading world, or diffusionist accounts of the spread of ideas of revolution and nationalism, the story of the Age of Revolutions may be broken up into these various vistas. So in this sense, it's an exercise, a sort of experiment in redeploying a long-standing label, a very long-standing label of a Euro-Atlantic historical writing, the Age of Revolutions, turning it on its head, dumping it in the middle of the sea, more truthfully, perhaps multiple seas in the south. So I don't propose that every act of decentering Europe should do that, for it's quite possible, of course, to detach ourselves from Euro-Atlantic periodization. But neither do I think that those who work on the global south, or here I should say the Asia-Pacific even, should leave the labels, the terms, and the periodizations of Europe sacrosanct. The book also implicitly and explicitly foregrounds the environmental context of the South as part of the story of this sort of molding of revolution to counter-revolutionary imperialism. So the waves here are physical and violent and disruptive. They shape the manner of revolution, and counter-revolution in turn depends on plotting and taming nature, and also on modeling the globe as a smooth space. In other words, the global itself is a product of this encounter between revolution and counter-revolutionary imperialism. I also argue towards the end of the book that imperial history writing that comes at the end of the period, from the middle of the 19th century, for instance, for the Indian Ocean and for the Pacific Ocean, is itself a part of this counter-revolutionary project of global modeling. So to follow, what's necessary then is to peel back these layers of historical writing that began from this period and that marginalized these spaces and these peoples, and layers of historiography which were racist and patriarchal too, and which surveyed from above in the production of the globe as entity, in order to then rework, as we peel back, to rework the story of this era from the global south and to repopulate this term of the age of revolutions. Now, since it's a public-facing book, a lot of the scholarly apparatus is in the footnotes, and the editors were quite insistent on this. So what I thought I'd do very quickly is to actually just lay out, oops, moved ahead too quickly, to lay out where this book comes from in terms of the literature very briefly. So of course, as I probably indicated already, the Age of Revolutions as a concept is a period term. But if we're thinking about the late 20th century, we can take in the works, for instance, of R.R. Palmer and Eric Hobsbawm. But for these scholars, the Age of Revolutions was an Atlantic story. So to quote Palmer, this whole movement was one common to the Atlantic world. For Hobsbawm, the regional volcano, which was his phrase, was in the North Atlantic. For Palmer, meanwhile, all revolutions since 1800 in Europe, Latin America, Asia, and Africa have learnt from the 18th century revolution of Western civilization. So effectively, the rest of the world has to wait for the era of decolonization to have an age of revolutions in this earlier historiography. Now, of course, there's been a lot of work since then in Atlantic historiography, and newer work has sought to decenter the North Atlantic, to move to the South, to the Caribbean, to write the story from the perspective of enslaved peoples or from the so-called many-headed hydra, to refer to the work in the middle there of Peter Linebaugh and Marcus Rediker. Meanwhile, Atlantic historians, David Armitage on the Declaration of American Independence, or Lynn Hunt, together with others on the French Revolution, have adopted the word global to track the global context and the global itineraries of events and processes in the Euro-Atlantic in turn. Janet Pulaski has tracked the story across Europe, and Bronwyn Everall, my colleague's work there on the right, for instance, is one instance of the foregrounding of West Africa to the Age of Revolutions, which has emerged. Turning to the Indian and Pacific Oceans, one vital context for my work is that of Chris A. Bailey, who also taught here at the University of Cambridge. And I used to joke with Chris Bailey that what I wished to do with the kind of thesis of the imperial meridian was to take it to the edge and to make Chris actually swim. And in some ways, I guess the reason I said that to Chris was because Bailey's thesis of the imperial meridian, though it wasn't Euro-Atlantic, and so it's different from a lot of this other work, it actually took Eurasia seriously. Nevertheless, it was terracentric, right? So the argument was partly about rising commercial classes and the landed elite, being linked up, and then there being this surge of patriotism and an age of revolt across Eurasia as a result of the linkage of those groups. And it was in concert then with these local and regional changes put together with global warfare, which then turned that sort of relationship between the local and the global, turned provinces then to modes of surveillance, to militarization, to racialization, state making, and so forth. And so the British Empire took hold. So what I argue here in Waves Across the South is that there is an oceanic dimension to all of this, but that we also need to attend not simply to the age of revolutions as an age of revolts, but one of counter-revolutionary imperialism as well. So the language of liberalism cannot be taken at face value. It was used to eclipse revolution. And additionally, it had intimate and cultural dimensions to it, which were patriarchal, as well as racist and violent, a point which Bailey doesn't emphasize as greatly. Now, it's never a good idea to say that nobody has done something before. There, of course, has been other work in the Indian and Pacific Oceans, which has sought to bring to the forefront indigenous peoples and facing empire indigenous experiences in a revolutionary age, to which I contributed an essay as well, edited from Sydney by Mike MacDonald and Kate Fulliger, is one instance of this. So in some ways, my work actually follows in the lead of Fulliger and MacDonald in trying to bring to the foreground indigenous presence, resistance, organization, and politics in the oceanic South. Clicking on the wrong thing here. Here we go. And just very briefly, I think I should just kind of give a shout out really to a scholar like Epele Haofa, whose wonderful essay, Our Sea of Islands, and his other writings have influenced the conception of this project. So one main point which Haofa makes is that small spaces, and in his case, Pacific islands, should not be treated as isolated specks in a faraway sea, but as deeply significant sites of energy and exchange for indigenous peoples. So in his famous conception, Pacific islands are not islands in a far sea, which is the colonial framework of it, but rather our sea of islands. So the need to really center and insist on the importance of small islands and seas, which are normally cast as empty or without history. So writing world history arguably then doesn't mean going for the big land masses. So having quickly sketched the overall argument, its methods, and also its placement in the literature, what I want to do very briefly is to go to two specific places. The book has a lot of geographical width to it. I'm not going to be able to do justice to that in the time that I have left, but I just want to use two examples really to give you a flavor of the material and what geography is doing. And I've picked out examples which also have an environmental dimension because Neilesh said that there was an interest in environmental history at your center. So first to the north coast of Tasmania. The first thing to remind ourselves about, on which there isn't much scholarly attention, is that the first fleet arrived at Botany Bay to found the settler colony in what became New South Wales in the year before the French Revolution. Meanwhile, there was a race to plant a flag on the island of what is now Tasmania. The British raced from Sydney after a French voyage headed by Baudin, imagining that if they, the French, planted a flag, they would claim this island as a sort of Republican base, effectively. So indeed, the taking of Tasmania by the British, which then follows, fits the classic elements of the Age of Revolution story of Anglo-French rivalry. But I'm not as interested in that. I can signal that, but I leave that to one side because I really do want to go to the coast and to think about the agency of indigenous women in the sealing camp on this coast. And so by doing that, it is partly an attempt to signal the raced and gendered dimensions of the story of the Age of Revolutions, which are in keeping with this broader account of geopolitics, which we might have expected even. So the sealing camp facing the Bass Strait was a polyglot community. From 1810, it included English, Irish, American, Portuguese, Lascar, Maori, Tahitian, and Australian Aboriginal members. And these men who were sealers and who were called sea wolves which again resonates with the concept of the pirate, which is an indicative concept of the age of revolutions. These men, the sea wolves, lived with Tasmanian Aboriginal women. It was the women who had the skills necessary to kill and swim with dead seals. So in this broader maritime world, and my argument in this chapter on the Tasman Sea encompasses also New South Wales, the relationship between fishing and constructions of gender was different to what was to arrive. Because of course, what arrived was the male European explorer and a culture of maritime exploration, which was heavily masculine on these European ships, which came into this space. And immediately after that, into Tasmania came also a language of protection, of liberation from slavery, linked in turn to the abolitionism of this era elsewhere. The humanitarian George Augustus Robinson, whose formation was in the age of abolition, sought to rescue Tasmanian Aboriginal women who lived with sealers. He wrote that white men had tied women's hands and forcibly conducted them to their boats. Not just from the sealing camp, but from elsewhere on the island too, Robinson transferred Aboriginal peoples after rounding them up to Flinders Island in the Bass Strait in the mid-1830s. The minimal agency that Robinson extended to these women on the Tasmanian coast becomes clear when one reflects on how these women were the prime providers for their families, responsible for gathering food from both the coast and the sea, known for their swimming, diving, and sea voyaging. The militarization of Tasmania, from military posts to the so-called, in colonial language, black line used to round up Aboriginal peoples, to horrific warfare, is in keeping with the Napoleonic Wars, as well as imperial warfare in South Asia, I argue in the book. But to return to the gender order of the sealing camp and the spills on scholarship undertaken by others, in the place of this sealing camp, there arose the liberal Christian marriage. Aboriginal women and Maori women, for instance, could be the wives of whalers in these waters, which linked mainland Australia, Tasmania, and Aotearoa, New Zealand in the next phase of the story, which unfolded. These women could at times take on household labor. These relations then, as time passed, transitioned into an age of land-based settlement, as whalers were transformed into settlers. Land-based settlement arose here with the philosophy of what was called systematic, quote-unquote, colonization in the period, which stood opposed to the supposed illiteracy, racial mixing, and slavery and plunder of a previous era, linked to the setting up of joint stock companies for colonization across the Tasman Sea. One such was the Van Diemen's Land Company, formed by an act of British Parliament in 1825, with the aim of applying its capital in Tasmania for the supply of wool for British factories. Its first annual report noted the intention of making loans to whalers and sealers in order to make them keep houses, to make them keep other buildings, and so forth. So one actually sees there the dynamic of the transition of this world of the sea into one of land-based settlement, and also in turn the transition of the gender order. The sealer and the whaler transitioning in turn to a different order of marriage in the period ahead. To link up the dots very, very quickly and briefly, that one could have more detail, by way of militarization or by way of geopolitics, the story should count in the age of revolutions, but so should it count by way of anti-slavery and humanitarianism. But really what I want to stress with this is that changes in gender and race too should factor in what the age of revolutions is. Aboriginal presence on water continued, but such presence was placed within the counter-revolution of settler colonization and its gender order. Secondly, and this is now the second case study, what I want to do is to go to Madras, Chennai. It may seem weird to place a sealing camp next to observatory, but actually in some ways that's part of the productive tension of what I'm trying to do here. And this is the Madras Observatory, It's a heavily masculinized space. There were women who were astronomers in this period of British rule, but not within an official institution like this linked to the East India Company. And here we have one classic moment, which is the pendulum length experiment to determine the precise curvature of the Earth from, in this image, from minute calculations of the fractions of seconds that it takes a pendulum to swing in a particular spot on the Earth. And these experiments were being undertaken in various parts of the world in the 1820s. But here in Madras, what it generated was the search for what was dubbed Experiment Island. So Experiment Island was an island that had to be located close to the equator, not off Sumatra, away from the pull of mountains, and where from Madras an expedition then goes out to undertake pendulum length experiments in this space of Experiment Island off Sumatra in 1822. And here we have a plan of this island. Now, the people involved have very English names. Peter Lawrence, John Robinson was sent off by the astronomer at Madras Observatory, John Goldingham, who was the chief astronomer. And they conducted something like 800 experiments. Lawrence had been in trouble for drinking too much and had to be checked out as a worthy observer of fractions of seconds before departure. And that is really a class sort of narrative of the disciplining of the observer who will conduct these experiments off Sumatra by a superior in Madras Observatory. But beneath the anglicized names of the others as well, the chief astronomers were not in fact English. Goldingham was Danish and had anglicized his name, Johannes Guldenheim, and that's in keeping with Danish presence in South Asia. And the other chief astronomer of the period had the innocuous name John Warren, and he was actually a Frenchman who returned to France in 1815 and then came back to India. The reason I stress this is because it is a link then to, once again, the Age of Revolution story. And it might be interpreted alongside the anglicization of the names, might be interpreted alongside then what happens to the Tamil Brahmin Pandit, the technicians, who in turn were placed within the British data machine. So I argued that the counter-revolution here is not about the go-between. So historians of science have spent a lot of time discussing go-betweens and intermediaries, and the Tamil Brahmin Pandits might be examples of this. But I'm actually saying that, in fact, this is not a story of the intermediary and the go-between. It's a story about modeling. And the modeling is about the crunching of huge numbers of data, huge amounts of data. So if you take out the records of the Madras Observatory, it's just huge amounts of stats. And the plotting of all kinds of things, from the sea to the air, from the shore to the land. And so it's really multi-dimensional modeling. And if one thinks about the pendulum length experiment, it's also a modeling of the Earth as a globe, so that it is possible then to understand the monsoon, so that it is possible to work out how to settle Southeast Asia and to have bases, port cities there for the empire, how it is possible then to trade between India and China. So all of these things become part and parcel of this modeling, but the modeling then in turn is really a detachment from locale and from the individual. And it's perceived as that by indigenous peoples. And here I use Abdullah bin Abdul Qadir, on whom a lot has already been written, but not specifically on his attitudes towards science and technology. He's known, of course, as Raffles' scribe. And here I rely on work with the Malay speaker in Singapore, Abdullah bin Abdul Qadir, writing about steamships. The coal looks like a rock or a stone, shiny, hard, and as if it were removed from the ground or from the mountains. And he noted that the cannonballs were as big as his head. So as I say, the point I make about the multidisciplinary data crunching, the reams and reams of numbers, is that it allowed a modeling of the globe, but also a modeling of empire. And this came not only with the effacement, and with this came not only the effacement of people like the Pandits working next to Raffles or Goldingham, but really then also the tabulation of labor Oops, jumping too far ahead. And here's an image from J.T. Thompson, the government surveyor of Singapore, who was critical in laying its early roads, bridges, and buildings. And in some ways, it's the precursor of an anthropological photograph. It shows Chinese men cutting stone. And the text that goes along with it is partly about the accommodation of the Chinese body with the stone. And the stone is being cut for the building of a lighthouse to ease trade between India and China. Despite all this disciplining of laboring bodies, colonized agency did carry on through this project, through rebellion, for instance, and also in very extreme environmental contexts where high waves stopped the work. So that's the next phase, if you like, after the arrival of steam, which Abdullah noted in the relations of revolution and counter-revolution. So to join up the dots again, this knowledge, which was scientific, was about the sea, the coast, the atmosphere, the tides, the times, which was also being tabulated out of the observatory. And all of that is central to the stabilization of empire as a global project over the uncertain medium of water. But in practice, this amounted to detachment and a density of numbers and models. And elsewhere in the book, I have a further account of the Bay of Bengal as a bay of war in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. So knowledge here did not only tabulate and model the intervention that followed, could actually amount to looting and warfare as well, for instance, in Burma, Myanmar, or Java, or Sri Lanka. So while what this extremely brief overview of two cases allows me to highlight is then a sort of broad account of the nature of revolution as it meets counter-revolutionary imperialism. But let me just end by saying something very briefly about something I said in passing earlier, which is that this counter-revolution was also about the production of history, and indeed the origin of the historical telling of the British Empire as a galloping force comes really from this era, because the twists and turns are quickly kind of effaced. The standoffs, the indigenous peoples in turn are actually squeezed out of English language histories, which start rolling off the press as we get into the middle of the 19th century. And so what I say is that actually the kind of nature of this imperial history writing of the middle of the 19th century in some ways follows the dynamic of the counter-revolution, because indigenous sources, narratives are folded into this English language print machine, a bit like what was going on with the observatory as well. And one telling example of this comes from the life of Robert Montgomery Martin. He's a man who publishes, he's got something like 267 titles to his name, which is pretty astounding. He works as a doctor in Sri Lanka, Ceylon, and the Cape, joins a survey expedition as a naturalist and surgeon from 1820 to 24, goes up the coast of Africa, reaches Mombasa, goes again to the Cape via Mauritius, spends time in New South Wales, works as an editor in Calcutta, so really connects up many of the spaces that figure in waves across the South. But then he returns to London and just starts producing all these books. 1834-5 sees the publication of Martin's History of the British Colonies, and 1839, Statistics of the Colonies of the British Empire. These are very heavily statistical works, dependent on blue books and things like this, very hastily produced, but they are sometimes, for some of these territories, very early English language histories of these places. And the troubling thing that kind of that is evident in looking at this man's life is that he also collects indigenous remains. He effectively kind of creates then this sort of flat imperial world of narration across the Indian and Pacific Oceans. And so very quickly, the sort of story of the twists and turns of gender, of race, of data collection disappear in this narrative, which is really the person surveying from above. And I would argue that it's been very, very hard for that narrative to be displaced. It's one that we're familiar with even today. In the popular hold of histories of the rise and fall of the British Empire, which carry on being written and sold in bookshops, and which have a particular public role in a place like Britain, where I work. So in response then, what I tried to do was to bring together these indigenous perspectives across the Indian and Pacific Oceans to create really a space of solidarity and to recover lost histories. And to make it possible for islands and coastal places which are often forgotten, not in the places themselves, by the way, but elsewhere in the West, they're often forgotten, and which were violently effaced from history, to actually come to the front seat of history, and then to kind of avoid a narrowly circumscribed historical narrative, which is circumscribed by a particular version of indigeneity, a particular nationalist politics, or even a kind of ethnic politics in turn. And as a sort of method, it's really just about juxtaposition, I guess. I'm not arguing for long distance connection across the Indian and Pacific Oceans, as much as for the particularity of these various subregions, which are oceanic across the Indian and Pacific Oceans. So not simple connection or comparison, but juxtaposition, which then highlights broader structural patterns in turn. So juxtaposition is essential, I would say, to the predicament that faces world historians, the predicament of keeping alive a commitment to locality in world history, whilst at the same time addressing these broader questions of transformation, which have given rise, or the transformations that have given rise to where we're at in the world today. So I'll end there and hand back to Neilesh, I think, or to the commentators. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. I just want to add very briefly that the the layers of internal as well as external comparative visions are visible within the work. There's one particular that really struck me between histories of Cape Town and histories of Port Louis that often are not talked about, and this is something that perhaps could be discussed in the Q&A. But there are many layers of both connections and comparisons that are brought to light in this kind of work. And Asia, the idea of Asia, in many ways, is much broader than most other accounts of Asia that we know of. So at that, I will turn to Dr. Mawani.
Okay, so I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the University of British Columbia is situated on the unceded territories of the Musqueam people. And I'm speaking today from my home, which is on the unceded territories of the Squamish people. I thank both for their hospitality. And I'd also like to thank Neilesh for inviting me to be part of this event. Sujit Sivasundaram's Waves Across the South is a magisterial global history of the 18th and 19th centuries told from the vantage point of the Indian and Pacific Oceans. What does it mean to compose a new history of revolution and empire from what Sivasundaram calls the forgotten quarter? Waves of the South, he tells us on the very first page, brings the Pacific and Indian Oceans together for perhaps the very first time in a sustained work of history. And as we've already heard him say, it's always dangerous to say that one is the first, but there is something really generative in the juxtapositions that he presents to us in this book. In shifting his orientation to the globe and in shifting ours, the book disputes the idea that the soul of the world was crafted in the West and then traveled east. For scholars of colonialism and post-colonialism, this may seem a familiar and well-trodden path. But in its repositioning, Waves of the South not only challenges the assumption that civilization progressed from west to east and moved from Europe to the global South, it also questions the dominance of the Atlantic Ocean, where the age of revolutions has been most often documented. Drawing attention to the Indian and Pacific Oceans opens a new set of geographical coordinates from which to view imperial and global dynamics. Place and perspective matter, Sivasundaram tells us. All of the chapters were written on site: Tonga, New Zealand, Burma, India, Singapore, Australia, Tasmania, the United Arab Emirates, Sri Lanka, Mauritius, South Africa. History looks so different when read from the ground, he writes, from the streets, the beaches, local bookshops, archives, and libraries. And what I think you can gather, if you haven't yet read the book, but you can gather from the presentation that we just heard, was the way in which Sujit is able to cast such a wide net and at the same time drill down and give us these wonderful details about various people who emerge and reemerge throughout the book. So how does one receive and process such a sweeping and reorienting work of global history? Waves Across the South, some readers might say, is world history written through a negative image. In photographic terms, and not in technical ones, a negative image is a reversal, one that darkens the bright portions while lightening the darkened and obscured ones. The negative image that I'm referencing here is not necessarily a practice of archival reading as it is for anthropologist Ann Stoler. Rather, it operates as a fundamental repositioning of the globe itself, foregrounding islands and small seas that are too overshadowed and eclipsed through our fascination with land and our focus on continents. Read accordingly, we glimpse traces of Sivasundaram's earlier monograph, Islanded, which focuses on Sri Lanka, an Indian Ocean colony under British rule. Similarly, Waves of the South is written from small and forgotten islands, Bourbon, now Reunion, Mauritius, Sri Lanka, Australia, New Zealand. Even Cape Town is reimagined as a critical point in a wider archipelagic scene. A focus on islands, as Isabel Hoffmeyer writes in the context of the Indian Ocean, operates as an anti-colonial geography, one that relativizes the territorial obsession of much nation-state focused history. Given that 70% of the earth is covered in water, Sivasundaram writes on the final page of the book, we're all islanders. His negative image of the world map centers the Indian and Pacific Oceans and its small islands as crucial sites of revolution and counter-revolution. So a central aim of the book, as the subtitle suggests, is to reconceptualize the age of revolutions from a different vantage point. For Sivasundaram, revolution must be viewed first and foremost as a surge of indigenous and non-European politics, which met invaders and colonists who washed ashore. There were creative practices and imaginaries already at place and in play in the island of seas along the Indian and Pacific Oceans. The revolutions unfolding in the late 18th and 19th century were influenced by what was happening locally and also elsewhere. In Chapter 3, which is situated in the Southwest Indian Ocean, the 1808 slave revolt in the Cape Colony, Sivasundaram tells us, drew inspiration and concepts from a multiplicity of events. The Haitian Revolution, the uprisings of mutinous slaves, and from the theology and doctrine of Islam. There were many revolts unfolding during the late 18th and 19th century, he argues, even in a single place. And this is a quote, the Cape Colony saw revolts of the enslaved, Boers, and indigenous people, and each of these was enmeshed with one another. Counter-revolution is also a key development that arises from the book's repositioning. The arrival of the British in the Indian and Pacific Ocean region, Sivasundaram argues, was counter-revolutionary. The British entered oceanic regions that were already marked by the presence of indigenous people, by inter-imperial contests between the Dutch and the French, for example, and by fears of revolts that happened and were unfolding elsewhere. In these turbulent oceanic spaces, Britain's imperial projections were never fully complete and were by no means a foregone conclusion. And we heard a little bit about the environmental aspects in the presentation that Sujit just gave, reminding us of the place of seals, of weather, of storms, which also pose problems to British imperial rule. The struggle between empire and revolution was a clash of waves, as he describes it, and Britain was one force among many. And I'll return to this point in a few minutes. This age of revolutions in the Indian and Pacific Oceans upends many categories of history writing, and Sujit just gave us a sense of what some of those categories are. And I'd like to focus on the category of the indigenous. So crucially for Sivasundaram, indigenous needs to be defined expansively. Throughout the chapters of his book, indigenous people are not rooted and tied to land as they are in many historical accounts and also in settler colonial studies. There are also people moving between and along the sea. In Chapter 5 on the Tasman Sea, we meet Cora Gooseberry, an Eora woman who resided in the coastal region of what is now Sydney. We also meet her well-known husband, Bungari. Casting archival documents widely to include paintings and objects, Sivasundaram gives us a compelling account of struggles over the meanings and representations of indigeneity. Through a careful reading of Kora's breastplates, Sivasundaram presents a counter-narrative, one that foregrounds the significance of Indigenous women as leaders in their families and communities, as highly skilled seafarers and fishers, and, as we just heard, sealers that developed ingenious hooks and lines. In Kora's account, Indigenous women were fishers and men were their aides in navigation. But Britain's entry on the scene dramatically altered these gendered relations. In archival records, Sivasundaram writes, Bungari totally overshadowed Kora. He had several wives. He circumnavigated Australia with the explorer Matthew Flinders and was gifted military and naval gear by Lachlan Macquarie, the governor of Sydney. Sivasundaram's readings of Kora's breastplates against European watercolors and oil paintings is the work of a highly skilled historian. Reading these paintings as part of the colonial archive and situating them within a wider imperial context, he notes the connections between different histories and geographies of Indigenous resistance and revolution. Like Bungari, Indigenous people such as Louis Van Mauritius of Cape Town or Toussaint Louverture of Haiti and Billy Blue, the Jamaican boatman, he writes, took up the theater of military clothing to play with and trouble colonial cultures. British reimaginings of Indigenous women and men, of femininity and masculinity, of Kora and Bungari, and of gendered intimacies and hierarchies, Sivasundaram notes, were a violent reordering of race and gender relations. Yet it is still possible to break this order apart, he insists, to find Indigenous perspectives and presence. Through its recentering of the Indian and Pacific Oceans, Waves of the South challenges us to rethink definitions of indigeneity. The constant movements of people and tumultuous oceanic words, Sivasundaram suggests, made these distinctions between settler and Indigenous often difficult to discern. To be sure, there are the examples of Kora, Bungari, and many others who are classified as Indigenous in the racial imaginaries of British writers. But indigeneity, Sivasundaram suggests, looks different from the vantage point of maritime worlds. And I quote, oceanic people were often on the move and may be better described as diasporas than Indigenous populations, end quote. He puts this challenge to work in various parts of the book. In chapter 4 on the Persian Gulf, which is an amazing chapter. Actually, I have to confess that after finishing every chapter, I kept saying, this one's my favorite. But this is really an amazing chapter. So in chapter 4 on the Persian Gulf, to give one example, we encountered Parsi shipbuilders and their wider networks of merchant families, moneylenders, brokers, and printers, including Lovji Nasarvanji, the first master shipbuilder who gave rise to the Vaidya family of Bombay. The chapter offers a wonderful account of the history and mobility of Parsi shipbuilders, including their efforts toward legal and political self-governance. In Sivasundaram's writing, the Parsis are not merely an elite merchant class or a highly organized minority community in Bombay. Rather, Parsi shipbuilders emerge as politically active and mobile agents that connected the Gulf and the British Empire by reworking local politics in trans-regional and transnational ways. But there's a challenging twist. Parsi agency, Sivasundaram writes, is in keeping with the surge of Indigenous activity which characterized the age of revolutions. Like the Qasim or the Omanis, these were people and communities on the move with unexpected connections. The traditional sense of Indigenous might be widened to include complicated mobile paths and heritages such as these. There's so many questions I could end with: the multi-species worlds of the Indian and Pacific Oceans that we heard a little bit about in the context of the seals and sealing, the place of ships, storms, and other animals. And I hope we can talk about this further. But I'll focus my questions on the politics of defining indigeneity broadly and on naming the British Empire as one force among many. So my first question is, what is at stake in casting Indigenous widely and diasporically? On the one hand, oceans allow us to foreground mobility, a conceptual framing that helps us to move away from affixing Indigenous people to land and to place. It allows us to trace processes of deracination that have created diasporas that have no claims to place or territory. And in many ways, casting indigenous widely really is an important diagnosis of our current historical moment in which these identities are intensely politicized. But is there a danger in this move, especially at a moment when so many indigenous communities continue to struggle for sovereignty over land, water, and the world? Second, Waves of the South encourage us to think of the Indian and Pacific Oceans as spaces of indigenous agency and as connected islands where the British were just one political force among many. And while I deeply appreciate the book's emphasis on the rich histories and textures of inter-imperial contests between the Dutch and the French, and on the polyglot worlds of the Indian and Pacific Oceans comprised of indigenous people, Muslim communities, Parsis, and other non-Europeans, I wonder whether to identify the British as one force among many is to diminish the violence of these oceanic worlds. And this is a genuine methodological question that I struggle with myself and in my own work. Does the emphasis on indigenous agency and on counter-revolution eclipse the violence of British sovereignty? And I ask this question saying that, or adding a footnote that it doesn't have to. And I'm thinking specifically of the work of Manu Kuruka, who Neilesh said was part of the program this year, and who's writing of a different historical moment and context. While empire was always challenged by indigenous and non-European people, the theft of land, the erasure of sovereignty, kinship, cosmology, and lifeways continue to shape the Indian and Pacific Oceans, including the spaces from which we speak today. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Those comments resonated with many different readings that I also have been thinking about vis-a-vis the use of the term indigeneity, which hopefully we'll have a chance to discuss. Now, let us turn to Dr. Rogers.
I would like to thank Neilesh for asking me to comment on Sujit's extraordinarily ambitious and wide-ranging book on the Indian and Pacific Oceans in the Age of Revolutions. I should note that world history is not my field. While I've taught widely in topics such as the British Empire and theories of nationalism, my primary identification is as a historian of South Asia, with a special interest in Sri Lanka. So I'm not qualified to comment from the perspective of current scholarship on fields such as world systems theory, so we'll stick to my perspective as an historian. I will begin with what I view as some of the strengths of the book, and then move on to aspects for which I have some reservations. In his conclusion, Sujit emphasizes how the dominant imperial ideology established during the period of high colonialism from around 1860 into the early 20th century continues to shape broader scholarly and popular perceptions of the British Empire, and by extensions, the origins of our modern world. These discourses render the empire as inevitable, the product of a natural superiority of modernity and civilization in the West in general, and Britain in particular. Recent scholarly manifestations have mostly dropped absolute assumptions of racial or civilizational superiority, but they still tend to assume an historically contingent practical superiority associated with developments in the West in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. This view has remarkable resilience despite many scholarly and popular efforts to undermine it. Sujit's effort to displace it offers a new twist and has the potential to have a considerable impact. There are a number of ways in which his work succeeds as a powerful corrective. First of all, the book covers a very wide geographical range, incorporating the Pacific as well as the Indian Ocean. Although the empire became more land-based as the 19th century progressed, for Sujit's time, period and purpose, the maritime focus reflects the course of imperial expansion and serves to connect his accounts of very disparate sets of events. Second of all, the book draws extensively on travel accounts, biographical sketches, anecdotes, and illustrations of paintings and drawings, which make it accessible to a very broad audience. So these two aspects of the book, its wide geographical range and its storytelling, provide an effective framework within which to hammer home a central point, that the establishment of the British maritime dominance was a very messy affair, which did not lead inexorably to the qualities later deemed as characteristic of the empire. He also brings attention to the wide variety of pre-existing sophisticated and dynamic social, cultural, and political forms in the areas that came under British control. It is especially welcome he makes this effort to claim sophisticated agency for places such as Australia and the Pacific, where the significance of pre-colonial societies is more often erased than on the coast of the Indian Ocean. Sujit also emphasizes the long-standing trans-regional economic, social, and political connections that preceded empire, countering the later colonial discourses that emphasize notions of stagnant cultures. He gives the global South some agency in the establishment and making of empire, for instance, in the role of the construction of colonial knowledge, but counterbalances this perspective by providing vivid accounts of the terrible violence sometimes meted against those who stood in the way of imperial power. Finally, he emphasizes the ramshackle nature of the early expansion, which was shaped on the ground by rivalries with the Dutch and French, and often included intimate interactions among peoples of European, Asian, and Pacific origins. The messy origins of the British Empire in the South, and by extension, the origins of modernity, are well illustrated by the collection of narratives in Sujit's book. The later imperial framework that emphasized order, the rule of law, trade, and humanitarianism was the product of a very messy and violent beginning. Now, I see this success as more than enough to make a successful and important book in British imperial history, one that virtually erases the government in London in favor of local perspectives. In other words, looks at the British Empire from a different part of the globe. But Sujit seeks to do more. I do have questions about the decision to organize the book around the concept of age of revolutions. One of the problems is that the phrase is used in the book has multiple levels. At one level, the term seems simply as shorthand for the time period under consideration, one that signals the importance of this age in the formation of the modern world. Sujit tells us that the age of revolutions is normally defined through the Atlantic world, particularly France, the United States, Caribbean, and Latin America. Though he doesn't mention, I think, Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, that book exemplifies this Atlanticist perspective. Anderson sees revolutions as providing models of nationalism that are later appropriated around the world. For him, modernity everywhere derives from these Atlantic revolutions. So Sujit's appropriation of this phrase for the study of the global maritime South can be seen as a way to emphasize the importance of non-Atlantic world areas in the making of modernity. One has to remember that the age of revolutions was, after all, messy in the Atlantic world as well. I think this is likely one reason Sujit decided to use the term, but is clearly not the only reason. From his introduction, the reader might expect that the conflict between revolutionary Republican ideas and reaction was played out in the Pacific and Indian Oceans as well as in the Atlantic. I mean, there is some of this in the book, of course, much of which is connected to the ideological aspects of power struggles among the British, Dutch, and French, all of which had a significant presence in the global maritime South at this time. Many of these conflicts played out mostly on the ground among persons of European origin in places such as the Cape, Mauritius, tiny Pondicherry, a bit in Ceylon. But it's hard to make too much of this, given that the early Republican ideals among Europeans were accompanied by a commitment to slavery and a determination to deny citizenship to persons of color. I mean, the case for the influence on the slave revolt is stronger, but all this is only a very small part of the book as a whole. This brings me to my final critique, which also stems from the way in which the study is framed by the Age of Revolutions. Throughout the book, Sujit claims that policies and actions that contribute to the establishment of British power in the Indian and Pacific Oceans are inherently counter-revolutionary. Sujit does not use the word inherently, but I am comfortable doing so since I could not identify any instance to the contrary. But to me, counter-revolution implies some sort of revolutionary opponent in the first place. I can see that one might argue that the expansion of the British Empire in general was counter-revolutionary in global history because it was in part directed against Republican or revolutionary regimes in continental Europe. But Sujit takes this argument much further, seeming to apply this to the establishment of British power everywhere in all circumstances. The trope of counter-revolution gives unity to a book that covers a remarkably wide range of cases. But I feel it is in danger of flattening difference, and it works against the book's effort to provide agency to the peoples of the maritime South. As Sujit's stories show, part of the agency of the South comes out in the ways different people and places responded to British power. So I feel that the insistence that everything is British is counter-revolutionary is unhelpful and even erases or de-emphasizes nuances brought out by Sujit in the individual chapters. This brings me to my final point, and here I'm perhaps being a little fanciful, I mean, going beyond the remit of Sujit's book. And that concerns the normative implications of the book. It is clearly an attack on colonialism as reflected in the insistence on both the trope of counter-revolution and insistence on the sophistication and richness of all cultures that preceded the British Empire. There are also examples of imperial economic exploitation, vivid accounts of the imposition of very unpleasant gender and racial norms, and Sujit in his presentation talked about the sealing and whaling camps, which was a very interesting part of the book. Imperial violence is highlighted as well. But does the book also portray an implicit, ahistorical, undifferentiated goodness in all that is pre-colonial, or even in all that is defined by the absence of the imperial? Looting and pillage, after all, and violence were not new to these parts of the world. And I was struck at the very tender way that Sujit treated the racist Europeans in the Cape and Mauritius when they impose imperial power, even though their class and they're very firm on defending their own class and racial position. There's nothing at all really about the hierarchies and injustices of Asian and Pacific states and cultures. These are downplayed, seemingly unproblematic so long as deemed legitimate by power holders who define local norms. So at a very general level, I ask, is this one focus enough in today's world where there is no escape from a global modernity tainted by its imperial past and present? That's it, Neilesh.
Thank you so much. There are so many wonderful issues now on the Zoom table, and we have 20 minutes to discuss these. And so what I'd like to do, we currently have 2 questions, but I think that the best way is first to allow Dr. Sivasundaram to respond to the comments as well as questions that were brought out by our 2 commentators. And I'll just preface those by saying that 2 things. One, the point that was made by Dr. Mawani about the category of indigeneity. In my reading of the work, there are plenty of spaces where there is a recognition of the instability of this categorization. And so where the particulars link up to a framework and a politics is perhaps something to discuss. It is not something that is, I think, only closed. It is an open and dynamic point that is threaded throughout the work. And it links up to some other discussions we've had in this very colloquium. David Chang, who visited us, who writes about this issue from a different angle, also has, and spoke about this at some length, has a position on this from a politics within, I think, the Pacific. And this links up to another point that Dr. Rogers made about the politics of understanding the nature of the pre-colonial. And I think that's one of many issues that is ready for discussion. And in that regard, I feel that the work in question is not fully, there's a space where there may be more discussion of how to integrate that element into this kind of a project. And that's something where I think we are all very excited to hear more about. So now I will turn it back over to Dr. Sivasundaram, and then we'll go through the questions as they have come.
Yeah, thank you so much, Renisa and John, for the comments, the generous comments, the critiques are very welcome as well, and for raising all of these points for discussion. I don't think we're going to have much time to deal with all the comments now, so maybe it's a conversation that we will have to have at some other point as well. And I realize that we probably do want to hear from the audience as well. So what I will do is I'll just kind of very briefly take the criticisms rather than any of the other comments. Yeah, so indigenous. This is something I've actually kind of taught a lot about over the years, partly because in the earlier work on Sri Lanka, which John knows as well, I was interested in tracking the concept of the indigenous as a period term. So originally in my kind of earlier work, I was interested in really the conception of the native, quote unquote, and the indigenous in colonial commentary. And the point that I made was that actually one needed to historicize the term first before doing anything else. And so that was the first move really in responding to that, because I found it to be a problematic category, partly for the way in which it's actually tied up with the kind of colonial imaginary in exactly the ways that Renisa sort of points out, in terms of it being land-based, in terms of it being localized, in terms of it not being diasporic in the colonial imagination at all. It's the colonists who are diasporic, it's the settlers who are diasporic, etc. So really sort of to track that as a historical kind of issue. But then in turn, as a way of contesting that colonial definition, to broaden it out dramatically. And so that's where I'm at the minute. Now, I don't know whether it works or not, and so I'm really curious to hear what everyone thinks about this, but really to broaden it in a way that is counter-colonial or even anti-colonial, and to juxtapose these histories which draw on shared heritages which are long-standing at times across the Pacific and so on, but which nevertheless are different to diametrically different to the colonial uses of the indigenous. Then in turn to actually kind of think about decentering as a practice that one utilizes in writing indigenous histories. So with the story of the Parsis, which I'm really glad that you picked up on, Renisa, and also the point that you made about what's going on in Cape Town, about rebellions being many, what I was trying to do partly was to actually sort of show that it's extremely layered, that it's not one story, but several. So between the the Gulf and Bombay are certainly the Parsis, but there are also all of these enslaved and people working on ships and a whole series of trades moving between the two. And so in a sense, the Parsis are part of the story, but they were decentered as the chapter proceeded into the next section. And similarly with Kora and Bangari, the idea was to decenter them in turn by turning to the Tasmanian Aboriginal women. So effectively to actually kind of practice a kind of decolonial approach to history with the concept of the indigenous as a repeated practice of decentering a particular kind of narrative which is elite here, or which is iconic or cast as iconic for various colonial reasons even, namely Bangari. So that's where I've got to with that debate about the indigenous. Now, in terms of the British as one force amongst many, and now I'm already aware that I'm probably speaking for too long, and this picks up on John's point as well, So this book comes out in the middle of huge heated debates in Britain, of course, about the legacies of the British Empire. And so the kind of pushback is from people who say that the pre-colonial was violent. So in a sense, the politics of the debate in Britain, from left to right, actually map onto that very axis. And I think it's really important for me to call that out here. So I think that, in a sense, it's not to minimize the violence of the pre-colonial. And in the Tongan case, certainly there's violence and raiding in Tonga prior to the arrival of the European raiders, but to say that actually there's a huge scale of difference between the two in terms of the global context in which they operate. And that we really need to recognize that if we are to actually sort of respond to the current debates afoot about imperial legacies. So certainly, I mean, it's not a kind of blindedness to the pre-colonial, but an openness, a kind of clear-sightedness about imperial violence, which is British, which is necessary in the debate here in Britain at the moment. Now, that in turn doesn't mean that all the other Europeans don't figure, but rather that actually, in a sense, there is, I mean, at one point in the past, I actually did argue that there was a lineage of empires and that one tracks the British against these other empires. But the dynamic really of counter-revolution casts the British as separate from the French and the Dutch, for instance, as well. Then on sources, I'm really glad that both of you picked up on the paintings and so forth. I just want to clarify that they're not just illustrative or about stories, because the point is to actually use them to open up perspectives that are not in the texts and the textual sources. So certainly it's useful that they make the book accessible, but that's not the reason why they're there primarily. It's actually to sort of decenter the textual sources. And so the narrative of messy to violent, actually, on first reading, John, I kind of agreed with you. But I think actually that too is a little problematic, I think, because one of the points is that the late 18th century and the early 19th century is ordering and is violent. And for a long time, we've thought of it as messy and romantic and so forth, and that the ordering comes later. But actually, the elements of ordering are happening here in this period as well. And then very quickly on Age of Revolutions, I'm doing this very, very quickly. Yeah, I mean, I think maybe I'll just leave that because I think that's a kind of really long conversation. But maybe just to clarify, it isn't only about the conflicts. So it's not about the geopolitics alone. And it's not, I guess, a technique that is going to appeal to everyone, certainly. But I think the point I was trying to make was that it's a really important category of the Euro-Atlantic. And so it's worth repopulating it. I'll just leave it at that.